that we put our best Branford High School foot forward, and that cell phones absolutely are put away, turned off. Okay, at no point in this next hour should they be taken out. All right. I'm going to go out. I'm going to wait the senator's arrival so you guys can just kind of relax a little bit at this point. And we'll bring him in here and we'll get started. So you know the format is, from what I understand, he will give a brief opening statement. And then the rest is a town hall format where you come up to the microphones. Again, you can form a line at the microphones if you like. If you want, maybe keep it to about 3 at each microphone. Then as one person goes, you can just kind of fill in so not everybody's waiting there. And then you would ask your question. Anybody have any questions at all? Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. Not those questions. All right, I'll be back in just a minute. Thank you. Kurt Blumenthal, Branford High School.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you so much. I can tell you very, very honestly, I'm so excited and proud to be here. I've been here on quite a few occasions, and the reason I love coming to this school is because it has great students, of course, and great teachers and great staff, and it's a great community. But particularly now, I'm excited and proud to be here because of the movement that is growing around preventing gun violence. I'm here to talk about any issues that you'd like to raise. Literally anything going on in Washington, I'm happy to discuss with you. But I think first and foremost, what we need to recognize, all of us, is that a new social change movement is unfolding right before our eyes. I feel the same way about this movement as I did about the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the marriage equality movement, women's health care movement. They have all been powered and fueled by young people. And I lived through many of them and was involved, in fact. So this moment in our history is profoundly meaningful to me personally. As a dad of 4 children, 2 of them have served in the military, as a citizen, as someone who believes deeply that we need to do more to prevent gun violence, and I've been working on this issue for two and a half decades, literally. I helped to write the first ban on assault weapons in the state of Connecticut, about 25 years ago. And then, and other common sense measures. Then I defended that ban in court when it was attacked on constitutional grounds, all the same grounds that the ban on assault weapons is now attacked. Second Amendment, equal protection, void for vagueness. I was the Attorney General at the time. And we won in court. I tried the case and I argued it in the state Supreme Court. So I have worked on this issue for a long time, but I feel nearer now to meaningful reform on gun violence than at any point that I can remember. And that's because of you. You are that change. You are what is different now. When I'm asked by people in Washington, you know, after Sandy Hook, you had all this legislation, universal background checks, ban on assault weapons, ban on high-capacity magazines. You had only 55 votes. You needed 60. What's different now? You are what's different. So I'm here to say thank you, but also we need to recognize that this movement requires sustained energy, perseverance, but also a focus on what has also made those other social change movements meaningful, which is elections. I'm under no illusions. Some of those measures I just mentioned have bipartisan support. I've just introduced a measure that would provide for a red flag statute, emergency risk orders. If someone is dangerous, in crisis and imminent risk, like the shooter in Parkland, who said to law enforcement, "I am going to kill people," that person should be prevented from having or buying a gun, particularly a weapon of war. We have that kind of statute in Connecticut, and it's worked. It's worked not only to take guns away from people who would do damage to themselves or others, but it's also made available to them mental health. And I'm just going to finish on this note. The solutions we have here are more than just one measure, one step. There's no magic one solution. It has to be a combination of a ban on assault weapons, universal background checks, high-capacity magazines, a red flag statute, eliminating the immunity of the gun manufacturers, closing the loopholes in the background check system. There are a variety of measures, but it also has to involve mental health and school safety. And so I hope we'll talk a little bit about gun violence. I hope maybe if you have questions on immigration, very much in the headlines this morning, the president tweeting no DACA solution, which is really an anathema, so abhorrent to me that the president would say we're not going to reach a solution for the dreamers, young people brought to this country through no choice of their own. 800,000 already have come forward, given the government their addresses, their names, their social security numbers. I'm betting that there are some dreamers in this building. They are future doctors and engineers. They are in our workplaces as well as our schools. And a mass draconian deportation of them would be a betrayal of American values. 800,000 people. And possibly as many as 1.3 trillion. But in the end, what we need really is comprehensive immigration reform. And I have been working toward that end. And finally, on the issue of the rule of law, which is tied to both immigration and gun violence, I am working to preserve the special counsel system and investigation that we have ongoing, which is threatened literally every day, again, in this morning's tweets from the president. So I'd be happy to talk about any and all of these topics, and I hope we get some questions. I'm looking forward to your questions and your comments, because that is usually where the best part of these kinds of forums occur. So why don't we begin? And I really finally just want to thank everyone who has participated in bringing us together, all of you who've organized it, the staff and leadership of the school. Thank you, Principal, for giving me this opportunity. So, thank you.
If students would like to come up to the microphones, now will be the opportunity to do that.
My question is, do you think the Second Amendment will be repealed, and do you support its repealing?
Do I support?
The repealing of the Second Amendment.
Do I support the Second Amendment?
Like repealing of it.
Oh, repealing of it. The question is, do I support repealing the Second Amendment? You know, let me just say, first of all, repealing the Second Amendment, I think, is unnecessary for preventing gun violence. And whatever I think about repealing it, I think it is a distraction. I think it's a great question. Distraction from what we need to do together. Because every one of the measures that I've just mentioned, every one of the measures that will help prevent gun violence is consistent with the Second Amendment. That's what I meant when I described earlier the court case that I litigated and others that have been before the court. The Heller decision provides for the constitutionality of every one of those decisions. So right now, the Second Amendment is the law of the land. I greatly respect Justice Stevens. He wrote a very good book, and recently an op-ed that takes from the book his argument for repealing the Second Amendment. So I would be in favor of keeping the Second Amendment, interpreting it so that it provides for common sense, sensible prevention of gun violence.
Thank you.
Why don't we go alternating microphones, if that's okay?
In regards to the Second Amendment, what you said, what would you say to a Second Amendment rights supporter and advocate of guns, of gun rights? And what would be your end goal if you could have your way of what you would do specifically to the rules and the laws restricting guns, what type of guns, and more like specifics about what you would do in that kind of a situation?
Another great question. I respect the rights of people to own guns. Law-abiding people have a right to own guns under the current law of the United States. And I am a law enforcer. I was a federal prosecutor, the United States Attorney, the chief federal law enforcer in our state for 4.5 years. I was Attorney General for a lot of years. So I know that guns can be misused. So do gun rights advocates. Lost and stolen guns are a major threat. That's why law enforcement authorities, the police, the FBI, are very much in favor of those common sense measures. They don't want to look at an assault weapon. They don't want to have to face a high capacity clip or magazine. They don't want to confront somebody who has severe mental illness and a weapon pointed at them. They see it all too often, and some have perished as a result. So what I would say to those Second Amendment advocates is that there are ways for law-abiding citizens to properly own guns that are used for recreation or hunting. They don't include weapons of war, like assault weapons. They are designed to kill people. That's the only purpose they have, semi-automatic. Bump stocks that can convert them into automatic weapons, machine guns that are outlawed right now. High-capacity clips of the kind that were used in Las Vegas. They're not used for hunting or recreation. And I think the appreciation that criminals should not have weapons is the reason why 90+% of the American people favor universal background check, including hunters and gun owners, and even a majority of NRA members. I think there is majority support for common sense measures that are consistent with the Second Amendment as I would interpret it. It provides a right to a well-regulated militia. And the idea that it's well-regulated implies there are going to be some constraints, and that's what the Supreme Court has said. And I would say to a Second Amendment advocate, America can be safer. We can prevent those 90 deaths every day. The majority of Americans want us to prevent those 90 deaths every day from gun violence, or at least as many as we can. We'll never prevent all of them. 60% of them are suicides. But we can make America safer. And I hope you will join me in this effort.
Thank you.
Senator Blumenthal, I want to thank you for coming today. I have 2 questions for you. First, there's been a lot of talks on gun control and gun bills and legislation. I was wondering if you agree with me that, like you've said, common sense laws. So why don't we get a bill that doesn't only do background checks, but it also has a mental health check? And I was wondering if you have anything in the plans of that for the future.
Do you want to tell me a second question also?
Oh, yes. And also, what is the most prevalent threat to our nation that we are facing today, in your opinion? And how do we fix that?
The most prevalent threat at home or abroad or both?
Or just whatever you feel is the most prevalent threat.
Okay. Wow. 2 big questions. A mental health check. I have to be honest with you. I would be very leery about somebody saying, I'm going to check your mental health.
Yeah.
Just broadly, I'm going to check your mental health. We all have to recognize that mental health has to be viewed as like physical health. We should remove the stigma of mental health. I wouldn't take a gun away from someone just because they had a physical health problem. The question really is whether that person is dangerous, in crisis, an imminent risk to himself or herself or others. That's what should trigger a court order or a warrant sought by either law enforcement or a person's family, preventing that person from buying or having a gun. And that's an issue for a judge to decide based on evidence, has to be fact-based, and it should involve statements of the person like, I'm going to kill people, or I'm going to kill myself. That's the way it happens in real life. And in Connecticut, we have experience with this kind of statute. 100 to 200 people every year have guns taken away from them. And the majority of them, as I mentioned earlier, actually then receive some mental health care, which they wouldn't otherwise receive. So this statute actually works, but it's not that everybody is checked. It's that there are signs of a problem that then lead to, in effect, a court order. It has to be due process. The person has to have a right to contest it before the judge and present evidence on the other side. So I think we need to eliminate the stigma of mental health and give people treatment whenever they have issues. And I have fought very hard for insurance coverage. It's called mental health parity, so that we treat equally, on parity, mental health issues and physical health issues. Insure them both. The biggest threat. The biggest threat at home, and in many ways the biggest threat to our country right now. And you may be surprised to hear me say this, because I have a feeling that you thought I might say North Korea, or maybe the danger of nuclear war, or some threat abroad like in the Middle East. I think the biggest threat we have is to the rule of law, our civil rights and liberties. I think we are in greater danger than at any point in my lifetime of losing critical rights and liberties. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. Just the other day, the President of the United States said that the Washington Post, which is a newspaper, was a lobbyist for Amazon. The Washington Post is a newspaper. That's a threat to our First Amendment. I think for the President of the United States to say that the folks carrying swastikas or racist slogans in Charlottesville are on a par with the demonstrators there who sought simply peacefully to express their views is a threat to our rights and liberties. I think that certain other elements in our society are a potential threat to civil rights and liberties. And the rule of law with attacks on judges, this is all stuff that's easy to overlook, because it's not like an explosion or some physical catastrophe that happens and is easily illustrated. It's much more abstract. But I think the biggest threat is to our democratic process. And that's why I'm very heartened by the demonstrations and walkouts and marches. But we also need to keep in mind that the marches and demonstrations and walkouts occur because we have rights and liberties that are protected. And by the way, people are dying right now in our military to protect them. They're giving of their lives, they're serving and sacrifice to protect those vital freedoms. I know it may sound abstract and ethereal and maybe even difficult to sort of put in concrete terms, but that's what I view as the greatest threat.
Thank you. So my question is the state government looking into the issue of vaping and smoking in schools?
I'm sorry?
Is the state government looking into the issue of vaping and smoking in schools?
Vaping and smoking?
In schools.
In schools. Smoking in schools or vaping is really not within the purview of the federal government. Those rules are determined by school boards and state governments. I will say to you that as Attorney General of the state of Connecticut, I led the fight against big tobacco. I actually went to court. And the reason I went to court was that the tobacco companies were lying, literally lying about the health effects or the health damage of tobacco and smoking. And to make a long story short, we led a coalition of states, and eventually the federal government joined us. We won a settlement. The settlement imposed new rules on the advertising. We won money to prevent and enable cessation of smoking. And I'm equally concerned about some of the vaping, because people become addicted to nicotine. But the rules that apply as to whether vaping or smoking is permitted in schools are determined locally. I have a feeling, I don't really know all the rules in Branford, but my guess is that there are rules that apply, and those are rules that have been determined by the school board, by the local government, and by the state government.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Senator. My name is Andrew DeBenedictis, and my question is, what are some measures you would like to see passed should the Senate flip blue after midterm elections?
Measures that I would like to see if the Senate changes hands, yeah, and we're in the majority. Well, one of the questions before was, in fact, the question over here, what is the biggest threat to our democracy? Or what is the biggest threat I see? One of them is not only the threat to our civil liberties and our democracy, but also the polarization that's part of that threat and the inability to get things done. The polarization, the partisanship, the fighting constantly, and the tendency to say, well, we can't get things done unless we have the majority. I am working, and I work every day, to reach across the aisle, literally, to talk to Republicans. The red flag statute that I mentioned earlier is co-sponsored, and I'm the co-leader of it with a Republican senator from South Dakota named Lindsey Graham. He and I are working on that statute together. If the Senate changes hands, I hope we'll have a better chance of getting it through, because gun violence, unfortunately, has become polarized. But I hope we'll have Republican support for it. It should be bipartisan. It used to be bipartisan. So I hope gun violence we can make a difference on. I hope also environmental protection. You know, tragically, environmental protection has become, again, polarized. It used to be, when I was Attorney General, in fact, we would bring lawsuits, Republican and Democrat Attorney General, together against polluters. Now everybody thinks, oh, the Republicans, Scott Pruitt, who is the head of the EPA, who has cut staff, he wants to decimate the agency, he wants to restrict federal law enforcement, he wants to enable a lot of polluters, he denies that climate change exists. Who would have thought that the party of Theodore Roosevelt would be climate deniers, would be against preservation and open space? Well, I hope we can forge coalitions if we regain the majority. I hope we can do more environmental protection. And I hope that we will also, if we're in the majority, on the foreign affairs front, push back against some of the Russian interference in our election. They are attacking us literally every day. This goes back to the rule of law. Their attacks on us are acts of war. Let me repeat that, acts of war. That's what I have said again and again and again as a member of the Armed Services Committee, as well as a member of the Judiciary Committee. This interference in our election system which the president seems to deny, but many of my Republican colleagues feel is happening, has to be effectively countered. In the cyber domain, we need to push back, we need to fight back, as well as in other areas where we could apply sanctions. We've expelled, 60 foreign agents. Well, the way to really get to the Russians is through their pocketbook, through the oligarchs. Stop them from laundering money through our financial institutions. They take money from out of their country and they want to park it in places that are safe, so they do it in our banks. We could expose that corruption. We could stop the money pipeline. We could apply sanctions to Putin and his inner circle, as well as to the Russian economy. So I hope we would have bipartisan agreement on that kind of step as well.
Thank you.
Hello, Senator. My question is, what legislative measures do you propose should be taken to curb the national opioid epidemic?
A great question. The national opioid epidemic, what measures would I support to fight it? Well, I see you're wearing, are you a baseball player?
Yeah.
Okay. I have 4 children. My wife and I have 4 children. 3 of them were baseball players. Our 4th child, our daughter, also was an athlete. They all had athletic injuries. They had surgery as a result of the broken bones and torn ligaments and all the rest of it, just as maybe you have or folks on your team or other teams. And at the end of the surgery, the doctor gave them a bunch of pills, right? Vicodin, Percocet, OxyContin, 30 days worth. And you know what I did with those pills? My wife and I took the bottle of pills and we said, good luck, you're not getting any. But not all parents do that. And sometimes kids have access, or any of us, any age, to those powerful painkillers. One of the ways that folks get started on addiction and abuse is through those powerful painkillers. So I have legislation that would restrict the initial prescriptions, would provide for more training for the physicians, and would establish rules as to how there are prescriptions. And here's maybe most important, what I've seen over the last 20 years is that the manufacturers of those drugs have a very powerful incentive to attract people, to promote it, to market it, make it more attractive, so that you would go to your physician and say, I'm really feeling a lot of pain wherever, I need something for it, and they would prescribe it. In other words, create the demand for it. So the rules on prescriptions and marketing and promotion need to be changed. Equally or more important, I'd provide more money. This latest budget bill, the omnibus bill, you may have read about, provides $6 billion, $3 billion this year, $3 billion next. Not even a pittance compared to what's necessary. We need more treatment for people who want to break addiction. And we know more and more about how to break the addiction. So the more resources we can invest, the better we'll do. And of course, education. The measures that I proposed would provide for more education so that people realize that certain drugs may be gateway drugs to addiction, painkillers, but also other drugs. Those are some of the measures that I would propose, but resources are so important. We can't just say no. We've learned that that approach doesn't work, right? We have to invest. We have to put our money where our mouth is.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Senator. My name is Giancarlo Giannini, and I just want to ask, being that you're a member and a player in the investigation of the Russian probe, what would be your opinion and reaction on a set of pardons for Michael Flynn and for Paul Manafort, and what would be your reaction on the president firing Robert Mueller?
Great question. I think the president firing Robert Mueller would provoke a constitutional crisis and conflagration, similar to what happened with the Saturday Night Massacre when President Nixon tried to fire the special counsel there. He fired Elliot Richardson and Bill Ruckelshaus. If the president fires Robert Mueller, we'd have the same kind of confrontation. It would be a crisis for our democracy. I would urge the president not even to think about it. But here's what my reaction would be. I have legislation that I've proposed, it's bipartisan, with 2 Republican senators to prevent the president from firing Robert Mueller. And I would like to see that legislation passed right now. So the president's put on notice, you fire Robert Mueller, a court will order Robert Mueller to be reinstated. That's what our legislation would do. In the meantime, I've written a letter to the 4 officials who would be responsible for firing Robert Mueller. Rod Rosenstein would have to be, he's a deputy attorney general, he would have to be fired for the president to fire Rob Mueller. And I've asked for those 4 officials to say, we will not fire Mueller. I've asked for their commitment. But I think it would be a disaster. That's why I have legislation to prevent it. And I have the same answer on pardons for Paul Manafort, who is under indictment for money laundering, fraud, conspiracy. He's the former head of the Trump campaign. He's part of the Russian, the investigation into Russian collusion with the Trump campaign and also obstruction of justice by the president. And I think that a pardon for him could well be, it would be evidence of obstruction of justice by the President of the United States. Likewise with Michael Flynn. He has been convicted. He's pleaded guilty. And reportedly, he is cooperating. I believe he is cooperating with the Mueller investigation. A pardon for him and a pardon for Paul Manafort, understand, has practical consequences. It diminishes their incentive to cooperate with the investigation. It undermines the investigation. It intimidates the investigators. And I think could be interpreted, should be interpreted as acts of obstruction of justice. So I would urge the president to avoid those pardons for them or for anyone else. And think of it for a moment. What would be a pardon? How would you look at it? It's almost like an admission of guilt, right? It's saying, I want to hide what those guys know. I want them not to cooperate. Because I'm doing it before, in Manafort's case, before he's actually tried, in Flynn's case, before he's sentenced, so they know, hey, you don't need to cooperate, you're pardoned. Now, also keep in mind, even if they're pardoned federally, there are still state investigations ongoing. So the Attorney General of New York and law enforcement authorities at the state level could still go after them, and they could still be subpoenaed to testify. So there's still avenues to get at their testimony, but a pardon would be a tremendous disincentive. Thank you.
Hello, Senator Blumenthal. I would just like to know that, I know that the 2018 midterm elections are coming up, and I was just wondering if the Democratic Party is looking at more promoting their agenda in order to obtain office, or do you think that they will be more attacking like the agenda being proposed in Congress right now? And what do you think is a more effective way of obtaining office?
Promoting the agenda
Yes.
in these next elections, I think is critical. You know, I think that we face a historic potential turning point in the Congress, not just because the Republican majority could be reversed in the House and the Senate, but also because America could be put on a better track, a better path. And not just on gun violence, on all of our domestic needs. We're shortchanging education right now. We're literally throttling many areas of education in science as well as humanities. We are imposing debts on students. You guys know this, right? Student debt is now the largest consumer liability except for home mortgages. How is that healthy for our country? Why is the United States government using you, students who are about to go to college, as profit centers? The government makes money from its student debt program. We have an opportunity to change that on opioid addiction, to do something meaningful to combat addiction and abuse, on environmental protection and consumer protection. There are all kinds of tremendous opportunities that we have. And, of course, gun violence, which I think should be the fulcrum because it has gripped the imagination and the minds of so many people in this country. It seems so bizarre and completely irrational that we should have unlimited ability to buy AR-15s, assault weapons, weapons of war. I think that anomaly has so riveted the American people. But I think the elections and this agenda, I've named a couple of the issues, are so tremendously important. And of course, I would just say, I don't know whether any of you have any plans to go into the military, but our programs for our veterans are in need of drastic investment. We need to, again, put our money where our mouth is. We say, oh, we salute our veterans. We need to do more for our veterans. That takes investment. I'm on the Veterans Affairs Committee. And as I mentioned earlier, 2 of my sons have served, one in the Marine Corps, deployed to Afghanistan, the other in the Navy, doing special operations. They're out now, but I see through their eyes what the difficulties are of coming out of the military to the civilian world. Many of our veterans, not my sons, come home with the invisible wounds of war, post-traumatic stress. We know more about those kinds of injuries than ever before, but we are still failing to provide the kind of treatment that our veterans need. And so those are some of the areas where I think the agenda can help any candidate who is up for election or re-election this November.
Thank you.
Hello, Senator. My name is Margaret Martin, and I was wondering if you can explain to me your views on privatizing federal prisons and how you feel that privatization would affect the lives of the inmates.
Federal prisons?
Yes.
A great question that we haven't covered. Criminal justice reform. You know, there is a bipartisan group that are working for criminal justice reform. Unfortunately, the President, Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, opposes many of the reforms we've proposed. One of the areas of reform should be prisons and sentencing. Right now, we still have a lot of mandatory minimum sentences for certain kinds of cases. For example, possession of certain illicit drugs. We have other kinds of laws. Mandatory minimum means you have to be sentenced to a minimum number of years. So a lot of the less dangerous criminals are in prison, and the more dangerous ones are not. That's what we need to correct. And so I think prison reform has to involve sentencing reform. It also has to involve more of what we used to call rehabilitation, which is just basically giving people skills, education, so when they come out, they don't have to commit crimes to sustain themselves. Recidivism, as you know, is one of the major ways that our prisons were becoming overcrowded. They are less crowded now in Connecticut and other states, but we still have a ways to go to make sure that we have meaningful reform. And I think those are some of the ways that we can achieve them.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Senator. So you mentioned before that the most urgent threat facing the American people is the encroachment of our civil liberties. And it's kind of a very popular belief within American conservatism that the Second Amendment was meant to be a check on the government and a deterrent to any possible uprising tyranny that could encroach on these civil liberties. What's your opinion on this interpretation of the Second Amendment?
I would reject the theory that the reason for the Second Amendment was to give people guns to overthrow our government. In fact, I think that the reason for the Second Amendment was to give people self-defense. As you know, there is no amendment, no right that is absolute. And the Second Amendment is not absolute. There is a provision for reasonable regulation. I think the best means to protect our liberties is through our democracy, not through force. I don't think the Second Amendment was designed to give people arms to fire at police or to take hostages. I think the Second Amendment was designed for peaceful purposes and to help people protect themselves in the event that there were criminals who threatened them.
Thank you.
Hey, Senator Blumenthal. I have a few questions on some stuff.
Why don't you speak up, because I don't think people...
I've lost, like, many people to, like, drugs and crime and stuff. What's your personal opinion on how we should solve, like, stop the opioid crisis and also the crime wave that's been happening recently? And also, I have another question about how the FBI and the law enforcement agencies absolutely fumbled the information on both the Parkland and the Sutherland Springs shooters.
Two separate questions. What to do about crime and opioids. I talked a little bit about opioids before, but you know, gun violence involves crime. The plethora of guns that we have, a lot of them stolen and lost guns, are partly a reason that we have deadly crime, homicide. Overall, in many parts of our country, including Connecticut, crime rates are actually down. There are a lot of different explanations for it. Some of it is better law enforcement by the FBI or by local and state police. But gun violence measures, particularly in states that now have lax gun laws, are a way to achieve it. You know, Connecticut has some of the strongest gun violence prevention laws in the whole country. But we're at the mercy of the states with the weakest laws, because guns have no respect for state boundaries. They come across state lines, particularly stolen guns and lost guns. So I think the movement that we're seeing in favor of fighting gun violence can help bring down crime. And how did the FBI fumble the Parkland leads? You know, everybody probably here knows that the Parkland shooter, Nicholas Cruz, called the FBI, called local police. There were lots of indications. And that goes back to the proposal I mentioned earlier, the red flag proposal. Think of it for a moment. The FBI was called and was told there is this young man who is a potential danger. The FBI actually couldn't do anything. There was no statute that enabled it to go to a judge and take away that gun or guns from that person. So I think that kind of legal change that I'm proposing, emergency risk order, could help the FBI in that kind of situation. They're investigating right now how it happened. No excuse for it. And they'll issue a report, and that report will answer your question, because I don't know more than what's been reported.
Okay, thank you. Blumenthal.
Good afternoon, Senator. Thank you for being here. My name is Lisa Kroger, and I was just wondering, nowadays I find there's a lot of increased stress on students and emphasis on standardized testing and like starting school with very early start times when there's a lot of scientific evidence for later start times. And I was just wondering, how do you find the whole education system and how could you see it could be reformed?
The stress on
And
young
the
people?
homework and everything.
You know, let me speak as a parent as well as a public official. I think young people have never been under more stress. I've never seen a generation under more stress. The pressure to succeed, to do well, to produce. But I have to tell you, I've never seen a generation with more ability and energy and drive to make things better, change the world, make a difference. So I don't have an easy answer for you, except that we can provide maybe more assurance that there are opportunities for involvement, that there are opportunities for education, that some of these choices you may feel are so crucial in the long run, maybe don't make that much difference, maybe more counseling. I would be interested in your ideas. I think the best answer I can give, I would be interested in your ideas about how we can do better. Because I'll give you an example. After Sandy Hook, the shooting there, I went to visit one of the parents, one of the moms, Scarlett Lewis. She lost her 6-year-old son, Jesse. And it was a couple of days after the shooting, and I went by her home. I sat in her living room, and I said, "Is there anything I can do?" And she had this idea for something called social and emotional learning for elementary schools. Social and emotional learning is really a national movement. It involves teaching young people how to express their disagreements, to resolve their disputes without fighting physically, how to adjust to being in a classroom with lots of pressures and competition and potential rivalries. And she formed a foundation called the Jesse Lewis Choose Love Foundation. And she asked me to help her. So I sponsored an amendment to the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. That's the measure that provides all the federal money for high schools and elementary schools. And in that act, I sponsored an amendment to provide more financial support for that program. Now, I didn't hire teachers to teach other teachers how to do social emotional learning, but we provided support for it. So if there are ideas that you have for ways that we can support efforts to reduce or eliminate some of that stress, it really, you know, it probably is something beyond my direct control, but if there were any ways I can help, I hope you'll let me know.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Senator. Thank you again for being here and speaking with us today. My name is Sarah Marsland, and my question is, you mentioned a combination of gun regulations and mental health programs would be useful to combat this issue of gun violence. And a majority of the people who have committed these acts of gun violence, these mass acts of gun violence, have also had histories of abuse toward women and domestic violence, Nicholas Cruz being the most recent example. Has there been any discussion of this aspect of the issue in Washington, and how would you suggest that we deal with it, this intersection of issues?
Great question. Let me answer that question by telling you about Lori Jackson. Lori Jackson lived in Oxford, Connecticut. She was married to an abusive man who physically beat her. She had 2 young children, and she sought a protective order against her husband. She left him and went to live with her parents with her infant children. Her husband was under a protective order, but was able to get guns because the protective order was a temporary initial protective order that didn't prevent him from getting guns. And early one morning, he went into her parents' home and shot her and killed her, while her infant children literally were next door, and her parents down the hall, and he shot her mom too, almost killed her. Domestic violence and gun violence are inextricably linked. Women are 5 times more likely to die from domestic violence if there is a gun in the home. When I was Attorney General, I formed an organization called Men Make a Difference, Men Against Domestic Violence, which was an organization of men to try to provide role models for young men, boys. And we go into schools, we have education sessions, we try to raise money for another organization called Interval House, which is the domestic violence center where women go to leave abusive homes. As you know, one of the most difficult things for anyone to do is to leave an abusive situation because of all kinds of psychological factors that occur. I sponsored something called the Lori Jackson Victims Protection Act, which would enable protective orders, whether they're temporary or permanent, to prevent sales of guns to the men and women, but let's face it, most domestic violence, 95% of all cases of domestic violence involve men acting violently or assaulting women. There's another interesting fact about domestic violence. In some vast majority of cases, I think it may be 75%, the men who commit domestic violence have seen or experienced it in their own homes. What does that mean? It means that it's a cycle. It's something that is taught, not purposefully, but it's taught by example. Young people are taught by what they see and hear in their own homes. It's the most powerful influence on anybody growing up. So when they see it and hear it, they're more likely to repeat it. So we've talked about mental health in connection with gun violence. This area is one that cries out for more mental health treatment. Not just laws, but also the kind of investment or resources that will help stem the opioid crisis, that will help stop gun violence.
Thank you.
First, I want to thank
I think I'm being given the hook.
No, we can. I think you could be here for hours.
These are great. These are unbelievably great questions. Maybe if I'm invited back, I can answer some more.
Consider this an open invitation.
Thank you.
I know a couple things. One is I know some of you have individual questions for you. I've talked to Senator Blumenthal's representative. He'll be available for about 5 or 10 more minutes just now if you want to individually.
I can stick around for a while. I know you have a schedule, and I want to be respectful of it. But I can, if any of you are free and you want to talk a little bit informally, be happy to do it. On both sides, I can see there are folks with questions.
But first, I want to thank all the students and the teachers for your unbelievably thoughtful, reflective, and relevant questions for you. So first, thank you guys very much. This is centered, this last couple weeks here at Branford High School has really been centered around student voice and how to amplify and make your voice heard. And there are more than one way to do it. Really just starts with choosing one of them and getting involved. Know that in May we'll have the registrar from Branford here to help walk you through or inform you how to get registered to vote. And let this be the start, this last couple weeks be the start of a continued movement. Because don't let just a tragic event every month or every 2 weeks be the time that we act. This should be something that, and I'll use what the senator said, is a sustained movement and sustained effort on your part. So lastly, I'd like to thank Senator Blumenthal for spending time here at Branford High School.
Thank you. And I just want to repeat my thanks. I know there are a lot of questions. I hope that you will come visit me in Washington, and I'm serious, invite me back, because I love these questions. They are just great. But also, we have an internship program. Some of you might be interested in considering it. And on the topic of elections and registering, the most powerful thing you can do is register people to vote or register yourself, and then make sure that people go to the polls, that they actually vote. But you have no idea how much power you have, the power of your example. You can shame people into voting and doing the right thing. You can lead them by your example. And so I really would encourage you to think of it not as a marathon, but not as a sprint, but as a marathon. Thank you.
Thank you. So if you have a question and you'd like to stick around, Senator Blumenthal will be available for a few minutes. I'd ask that Jaylene and Andrew and the other organizers can come over. I said you can come over and answer some questions, and everyone else, I'd ask you to go to your Period 8 class. Thank you.
Abby? Nice to meet you, right? Yeah, totally.
Just
a really quick question.